Good morning, everyone. Brett Kavanaugh speaking from my chambers on what's turning out to be the most eye-opening morning I've had since joining the Supreme Court. So I'm sitting here with my morning coffee, make that a double espresso because I barely slept after what I learned yesterday when I realized I need to share something with you that most Americans have no idea about, something that goes to the very heart of who controls this country. Yesterday afternoon, I had lunch with someone I can't name. Let's just say he's worked in the Treasury Department under 4 different administrations and knows where all the financial bodies are buried. What he told me about the Federal Reserve System is going to blow your mind. And folks, this isn't conspiracy theory stuff. This is documented fact that's been hidden in plain sight for over a century. The phone call that started everything. It all began 3 weeks ago when I got a call from an old colleague who now works as a financial attorney for some very large banks. Brett, he says, you need to understand something about the cases that come before your court involving monetary policy. The Federal Reserve isn't what you think it is. Now, I thought I understood the Fed pretty well. Central bank, controls interest rates, manages monetary policy, reports to Congress. Basic stuff you learn in any economics class, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. The Federal Reserve, my friend tells me, isn't federal and it doesn't have reserves. It's a private banking cartel that's been given governmental authority to create money out of thin air. And the profits from that money creation don't go to the American people. They go to private shareholders. That got my attention real quick. We arranged to meet for lunch, and what I learned over the next 2 hours has kept me awake ever since. The constitutional fraud. Let me start with the most shocking revelation. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 may be the greatest constitutional fraud in American history. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress, and only Congress, the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, not delegate that power to a private corporation, not share that power with private banks, exercise that power directly. But in 1913, Congress passed a law that essentially gave away one of its most important constitutional responsibilities to a group of private banks. And they did it during Christmas break when most members of Congress had already gone home. My lunch companion, let's call him David, explains how it worked. The big banks had tried for decades to establish a central bank. The American people kept rejecting it because they understood it would give private bankers control over the money supply. So the bankers got smart. They packaged it as a government agency and called it the Federal Reserve System. But here's the kicker, David continues. The Federal Reserve banks are privately owned by member banks. The Board of Governors might be appointed by the president, but the real power is in the regional Federal Reserve banks, and those are owned by private commercial banks. Think about that for a minute. The institution that controls America's money supply is owned by the very banks it's supposed to regulate. The ownership structure nobody talks about. David pulls out his tablet and shows me something I'd never seen before, the actual ownership structure of the Federal Reserve System. Look at this, he says. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful Fed bank, is owned by these member banks: JPMorgan Chase, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and a handful of others. These banks don't just influence Federal Reserve policy, they own the institution that makes Federal Reserve policy, and when the Fed creates money, these banks get first access to that money at essentially 0 interest rates. But here's where it gets really interesting. The profits that the Fed makes from creating money and lending it to the government after expenses and a 6% dividend to the member banks, the surplus goes back to the Treasury. But guess who determines what counts as expenses and what counts as surplus? The Fed itself. The private banks that own the Fed get to decide how much profit they keep and how much they return to the American people. Supreme Court cases they don't want you to know about. As we're talking, I start thinking about Federal Reserve cases that have come before the court, and I realize there's a pattern I'd never noticed before. In every case challenging the Fed's authority, the government's legal briefs are written in a way that avoids discussing the constitutional issues. Instead, they focus on technical economic arguments and defer to the Fed's expertise. But here's what really bothers me. When the Fed is challenged in court, who represents them? Not government lawyers from the Justice Department, private attorneys from the same law firms that represent the major banks. David explains why the Fed has to maintain the fiction that it's a government agency when it's convenient and a private entity when that's more advantageous. So when someone sues the Fed over its policies, it's represented by private counsel because it's technically a private corporation. But when Congress questions Fed policy, the Fed claims it's an independent government agency that can't be subjected to political interference. They get to have it both ways, depending on what serves their interests. The money creation scam. Now here's where things get really disturbing. David explains how money creation actually works, and it's nothing like what they teach in economics textbooks. When the government needs money, he says, the Treasury issues bonds. The Federal Reserve buys those bonds by creating money electronically, literally typing numbers into a computer. No gold backing, no reserves, no actual assets, just digital entries. The government then pays interest on those bonds to the Fed. So the American taxpayers are paying interest to private banks for the privilege of using money that the banks created out of nothing. But it gets worse. The Fed then uses those government bonds as collateral to create even more money, which it lends to member banks at low interest rates. So the same money gets leveraged multiple times, generating profits at every level. Think about this. Private banks create money out of nothing, loan it to the government, collect interest from taxpayers, then use the government's debt as collateral to create even more money. It's the greatest scam in human history, and it's completely legal because Congress gave them the authority to do it. The interest rate manipulation. David shows me something that really opens my eyes. The real reason the Fed manipulates interest rates has nothing to do with managing the economy and everything to do with maximizing bank profits. When the Fed lowers interest rates, he explains, it's not trying to stimulate economic growth. It's giving member banks access to cheap money that they can then lend at higher rates. The spread between what banks pay for money and what they charge for loans is pure profit. And when the Fed raises rates, it's not fighting inflation. It's ensuring that existing debt becomes more expensive to service, which forces more borrowers into default, which allows banks to seize collateral. This explains something that's always puzzled me. Why Fed policy never seems to benefit regular Americans. Lower rates don't make mortgages more affordable because banks tighten lending standards. Higher rates don't help savers because banks keep deposit rates artificially low. Fed policy is designed to benefit banks, not the American people. The congressional theater. I start asking David about congressional oversight of the Fed, and what he tells me is disturbing. Congress pretends to oversee the Fed through hearings and testimony, he says, but it's all theater. The Fed chair comes to Congress twice a year, gives vague statements about economic conditions, and deflects any serious questions by claiming they need to maintain independence. Meanwhile, the same members of Congress who are supposedly overseeing the Fed receive campaign contributions from the banks that own the Fed. And when they leave Congress, many of them get lucrative jobs in the financial industry. He gives me specific examples. Former Fed officials who now work for Goldman Sachs, former Treasury secretaries who became bank CEOs, former congressmen who joined bank boards after leaving office. The revolving door between the Fed, Treasury, Congress, and Wall Street isn't a bug in the system, David explains. It's a feature. It ensures that everyone who's supposed to be regulating the banks ends up working for the banks. The audit resistance. This brings up something that's always bothered me. Why does the Fed resist auditing so fiercely? Because, David says, a real audit would reveal that the Fed has been operating outside its legal authority for decades. It would show the massive conflicts of interest, the preferential lending to certain banks, the coordination with foreign central banks without congressional approval. More importantly, it would reveal the true beneficiaries of Fed policy, and those beneficiaries aren't the American people. He shows me documents from the partial Fed audit that was conducted after the 2008 financial crisis. Even that limited audit revealed $16 trillion in secret loans to banks, corporations, and foreign entities, not billion, trillion. And that was just what they were forced to disclose, David notes. Imagine what a complete audit would reveal. The 2008 bailout reality. Speaking of 2008, David gives me the real story of the financial crisis bailouts, and it's not what the public was told. The official story is that the Fed and Treasury had to bail out the banks to prevent economic collapse, he says. But here's what really happened. The Fed created trillions of dollars out of nothing and gave it to the same banks that caused the crisis. Meanwhile, millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure by those same banks. The banks got free money, homeowners got evicted. But here's the part that really gets to me. The banks didn't just get bailout money. They got that money at zero interest, while American consumers were still paying credit card interest rates of 15–20% to those same banks. The Fed essentially transferred trillions of dollars from American taxpayers to bank shareholders, and they called it economic stimulus, the inflation tax. David explains something that I'd never thought about as a constitutional issue. Inflation is actually a tax imposed without congressional approval. When the Fed creates new money, he says, it doesn't create new wealth, it just dilutes the value of existing money. So everyone who holds dollars gets poorer, while the banks that get first access to the new money get richer. That's a tax on every American's savings, imposed without a vote in Congress, collected by private banks. How is that constitutional? He's absolutely right. The Constitution requires that all taxes be imposed by Congress, but the Fed imposes the inflation tax through money creation without any congressional vote. And here's the kicker. The inflation tax hits poor and middle-class Americans the hardest, while benefiting wealthy Americans who own assets that appreciate during inflation. It's the most regressive tax in the American system, and it's imposed by a private banking cartel, the foreign central bank connections. Then David tells me something that really disturbs me from a national sovereignty perspective. The Fed coordinates its policies with foreign central banks without congressional oversight. The Fed has currency swap agreements with the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and others. He explains, when there's a crisis in Europe or Asia, the Fed can create dollars and loan them to foreign central banks. Essentially, American taxpayers are backing the monetary policies of foreign governments, and Congress has no say in it. He shows me documents revealing that during the 2008 crisis, the Fed loaned hundreds of billions of dollars to European banks. Not American banks, European banks. The Fed was more concerned with propping up European financial institutions than helping American homeowners facing foreclosure, David notes. How is that serving American interests? The digital currency trap. This brings us to something that really worries me as a constitutional scholar, the Fed's push for a central bank digital currency, CBDC. David explains the implications. A digital dollar controlled by the Fed would give the banking cartel unprecedented power over every American's financial life. Every transaction could be monitored, controlled, or blocked. Want to donate to a political candidate the banks don't like? Transaction blocked. Want to buy something the government disapproves of? Transaction denied. Want to save money instead of spending it? Negative interest rates force you to spend. This isn't speculation. Other countries are already implementing CBDCs with these exact features. And here's the constitutional problem, David continues. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches, but a CBDC would give the Fed access to every financial transaction without a warrant. The Fed, a private banking cartel, would have more surveillance power over Americans than the NSA. The Supreme Court's complicity. As I'm learning all this, I start to feel sick about the Supreme Court's role in enabling this system. In case after case involving Fed policy, we've deferred to the Fed's expertise and avoided constitutional questions. We've treated the Fed as if it were a legitimate government agency when it's actually a private corporation exercising governmental power. David puts it bluntly, the Supreme Court has been complicit in the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. Every time you refuse to address the constitutional issues around Fed policy, you're enabling private banks to steal from the American people. He's not wrong. We've allowed constitutional violations to continue because addressing them would be economically disruptive, but constitutional rights aren't subject to economic convenience. The real reason for government debt. Here's something that really opened my eyes. David explains that government debt isn't a bug in the system. It's the whole point. The banking cartel doesn't want the government to pay off its debt. He says, government debt is the foundation of the entire monetary system. Without government debt, there would be no basis for money creation. That's why every solution to fiscal problems involves borrowing more money instead of creating money debt-free. The banks profit from the debt, not from fiscal responsibility. This explains why both parties continue to increase government debt regardless of their campaign promises. It's not incompetence or lack of will. The system is designed to create permanent indebtedness. The goal, David explains, is to keep the government permanently indebted to private banks, ensuring a steady stream of interest payments from taxpayers to bank shareholders. It's not a fiscal policy, it's a wealth extraction mechanism, the international angle. David then shows me something that really disturbs me, how the Fed coordinates with international banks to manipulate global currency markets. The Fed doesn't just control American monetary policy, he explains, through currency swaps, coordinated interest rate policies, and international banking relationships. The Fed helps maintain dollar dominance globally. But that dollar dominance benefits the banks that own the Fed, not necessarily American workers or businesses. He gives me examples of how Fed policy has been used to destabilize foreign governments that challenge dollar dominance, prop up allies regardless of their economic fundamentals, and maintain a global system that extracts wealth from developing countries. The Fed is essentially the central bank for a global banking empire, David concludes. American national interests are secondary to banking cartel interests. My constitutional crisis. As I sit here reflecting on everything David told me, I'm facing a constitutional crisis of my own. How can I continue to participate in a system that treats a private banking cartel as if it were a legitimate government agency? Every case involving Fed policy that comes before the court forces me to choose between constitutional principles and economic stability. And so far, like my colleagues, I've chosen stability. But stability for whom? Not for the American people who are being systematically robbed through inflation, debt, and monetary manipulation. Stability for the banking system that profits from this arrangement. The Constitution doesn't have an exception clause that says constitutional rights can be suspended for economic convenience. But that's effectively what we've been doing for over a century, the path forward. I don't have easy answers, but I know this. The American people deserve to know how their monetary system really works. They deserve to know who profits from money creation, and they deserve to have their constitutional rights respected, even if it's economically inconvenient. Maybe it's time for the Supreme Court to stop deferring to Fed expertise and start asking constitutional questions. Maybe it's time for Congress to reclaim its constitutional authority over money creation. Maybe it's time for Americans to demand that their monetary system serve their interests instead of enriching a private banking cartel. The Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value. It doesn't give Congress the power to delegate that authority to private banks. If we're going to have a central bank, it should be truly public, truly accountable, and truly serving the American people. What this means for you. So what does all this mean for regular Americans trying to make sense of their financial lives? It means that inflation isn't a natural economic phenomenon. It's a policy choice that benefits banks at your expense. It means that government debt isn't a fiscal crisis. It's a wealth transfer mechanism from taxpayers to bank shareholders. It means that Fed policy isn't designed to help the economy. It's designed to maximize bank profits. And it means that your constitutional rights are being violated every day by an institution that pretends to be part of your government, but actually serves private interests. The good news is that once you understand how the system works, you can make better decisions about how to protect yourself. The bad news is that individual protection isn't enough. This system requires collective action to change. Looking ahead. That lunch with David happened 2 weeks ago, but I think about it every day because it's changed how I see every case that comes before our court involving monetary policy, banking regulation, or government finance. I can't unsee what I've learned. I can't pretend that the Fed is just another government agency doing its best to manage the economy. The Federal Reserve is a private banking cartel that has been granted governmental authority to create money, manipulate interest rates, and extract wealth from the American people. And that arrangement violates the most basic principles of constitutional government. The question is, what to do about it? How do you restore constitutional monetary policy without destroying the entire financial system? How do you reclaim democratic control over money creation without causing economic chaos? These aren't easy questions, but they're questions we have to start asking because the current system is unsustainable, unconstitutional, and fundamentally unjust. Thanks for listening, folks. Next week, we'll dive into something equally disturbing: how the same banking interests that control the Fed have captured other government agencies through the revolving door system. Until then, keep asking who really benefits from government policy, because the answer is usually the same people who write the checks.